The islands of Hawaii are sold to the world as a paradise of warm breezes, soft sand, and water so clear it looks unreal, but no one tells you what waits after the sun sinks, and the tourists hide in their hotels, because when darkness settles over those mountains, something old rises from places that were ancient long before any American flag ever touched these shores. And in the month of November in the year 2019, a 12-man reconnaissance element from Echo Company learned that fact in a way none of them would ever forget, and 4 of them would never come home from it. And I am going to tell you exactly what happened using the journal notes of Private Michael Torres, the classified reports that officers tried to bury, and the words of the survivors who still struggle to sleep at night, because the truth does not stay buried forever, and neither do the warriors who once ruled these islands with sacred authority and deadly purpose. And it all began on November 14th, 2019, at 14:30 hours inside a briefing room on Marine Corps Base, Hawaii, where the smell of burnt coffee and nervous sweat hung in the air, while 12 Marines sat in metal chairs, facing a projector that painted the walls with a pale blue map of the Kahuku training area, and Captain Jonathan Hale stood at the front with a red laser pointer that traced the ridges and valleys like he was carving them into our memories. And he was young for a company commander, only 30 years old, but he had earned respect in blood with 2 combat tours in Afghanistan and a Bronze Star for dragging wounded men from a burning vehicle under fire. And no one in that room doubted a single word he said as he briefed us on Operation Nightfall, a 72-hour reconnaissance surveillance exercise in the Kahuku Mountains. And when he clicked to the next slide, the map revealed terrain so tight with contour lines that the most seasoned Marines shifted in their seats because thick jungle rose on both sides of the insertion zone like the jaws of a trap. And Hale explained that we would be inserted by CH-53 at a grid point written on the screen as 21.5847 by -157.9283. And then we would patrol, establish covert positions, and run escape and evasion drills once the opposing force began hunting us on day 2 in private first class. Michael Torres sat in the 3rd row, scribbling in the small green notebook he carried everywhere, writing down every detail, because he believed recording everything made him sharper, even though the others teased him for it. And he wrote that something felt wrong, though he could not explain why. And Hale addressed the quiet talk about Hawaiian folklore, about ancient warriors and ghostly processions and drums in the night. And he dismissed each legend with hard military certainty, telling us that Marines do not fear stories, and we do not let superstition interfere with operations. And we all answered, "Yes, sir," but Sergeant Daniel Kim, sitting at the back, watched with the eyes of a man who had survived things he could never fully share. And he shook his head at Torres with a silent warning that made the younger Marine feel a cold ripple down his spine. And then Lieutenant Samuel Collins took over the briefing, explaining equipment checks scheduled for 0500, the insertion at 0630, and the tropical system forming to the southwest that might disrupt extraction. And Corporal Marcus Lee asked about communications because the mountains kill radio waves, and Collins confirmed that satellite links would be used only as backup, and each fire team would carry PRC-152 units with extra batteries. And he added that new thermal imaging gear would be field tested, and Lee, who had a gift for electronics, made careful notes, knowing he would be the one to notice anything strange out there. And the briefing lasted another hour, covering patrol routes, emergency procedures, and contingencies, until Hale dismissed us, and the sun outside dipped toward the ocean, painting the sky orange and purple in colors that should have felt peaceful but did not. And Torres lingered outside, staring at the distant a range where steep cliffs rose like ancient walls, and the mist clung to their peaks like spirits unwilling to leave. And Kim lit a cigarette beside him and asked if he had ever trained in those mountains, and Torres answered no. And Kim told him that certain places were avoided by locals for reasons that had nothing to do with terrain, that there were old paths meant only for the dead. And he spoke of the night marchers, the Huakai-Po, ancient warriors who continue their eternal procession. And Torres felt another chill as the sergeant walked away, leaving the mountains looming silent and watchful, as if already aware that 12 Marines would soon be stepping into a world that did not belong to them at all. Kim kept his face unreadable as he spoke of the Huakai-Po and explained how the ancient Hawaiian warriors still marched through the night on paths older than any modern map, and how those who saw them faced a choice as simple as life or death, to lie face down and remain still until the procession past or to run and pray that the living could outrun the dead, and Torres asked if he truly believed such stories, and Kim answered that every culture carries its warnings for reasons born from truth, and that the mountains had existed for millions of years, and did not care about any marine who dared to walk where old power still lingered, and he advised Torres to sleep because they would need strength for what lay ahead. And in the early morning of November 15th, 2019 at 06:15 hours, the CH-53 Super Stallion thundered across the Kahuku canopy. At 12 Marines sat inside gripping straps and weapons, while thick humid air surged through the aircraft, and Torres stared down at the jungle below, seeing nothing but endless green with no roads, no structures, nothing that resembled human presence. And the crew chief signaled 2 minutes to the landing zone, and Captain Hale stood steady against the violent sway and reminded everyone that once they hit the ground, they would secure the perimeter, move to the rally point, and follow standard insertion protocol with discipline and precision. And then the helicopter flared hard, and the clearing rose up beneath them, and rotor wash flattened tall grass into swirling chaos. And the men poured out of the ramp like a well-rehearsed storm, securing positions and scanning the tree line, while the massive aircraft lifted away, growing smaller, until its sound dissolved into the quiet. And that quiet was wrong, because jungles are supposed to breathe and chatter with birds and insects, yet this one felt as if every creature had hidden from something waiting to pass. And Hale ordered the element to rally, and Torres fell into the patrol column behind Kim, who moved with the silent confidence of a veteran who had lived through more than he ever shared. And the jungle swallowed them whole with walls of foliage, so dense visibility rarely reached 20 meters. And they navigated by compass because GPS was restricted, and the terrain punished every step with deep ravines, steep ridges, and tangled vines that clawed at uniforms and slowed progress. And Torres wrote observations in his notebook during halts, noting clear streams, difficult climbs, and the strange absence of wildlife that left the air feeling hollow. And watched, and they reached a plateau near the summit of a nameless rise and established their patrol base with fighting positions dug, communications set, and security posted. And during equipment setup, Corporal Lee noticed something wrong in the thermal readings, because multiple heat signatures were moving in formation 800 meters southwest, and their patterns did not match animals and were too organized to be anything wild. And Collins pointed out that the opposing force was not scheduled until day 2, and Lee confirmed it and explained that the signatures moved like a patrol single file through the jungle. And Hale studied the device, and for a heartbeat something like fear flickered in his eyes before he masked it and chalked the signatures up to wild pigs, though no one with any sense believed that. And Torres saw the silent exchange between Kim and Lee, who both understood something stranger was unfolding. And as daylight faded, Torres wrote his final entry of evening, noting that the jungle was too quiet and the thermal readings were wrong, and Kim had not smiled once all day. And he admitted he felt watched, though everyone insisted nothing was wrong, yet he knew something waited in those trees. And at exactly 23:47 hours, the first sound drifted through the night as Torres stood sentry on the northern edge, fighting exhaustion. And he heard a deep rhythmic thumping he first mistook for his imagination, until it came again, louder and unmistakable, as drums and chanting followed, low and ancient, rising beneath the beat like voices carried from another time. And he reported it softly over the radio, and Collins questioned him, but the drums grew louder, and soon everyone scrambled into positions. And Kim slid beside Torres and told him not to move, not to breathe. And Torres asked what it was, but Kim kept his answer locked behind a fear he could not hide. And then torches appeared flickering between trees, and dozens of them moved in a long column that wound through the jungle like a river of fire. And Torres whispered updates into his radio, counting more than 30 light sources. And then the drums stopped, and the chanting ceased, and the jungle fell into a silence so absolute it felt like death itself. And through his night vision, Torres saw tall, faceless warriors emerging from the tree line, armed with ancient weapons and wearing feathered cloaks and headdresses. And their movements were perfect, rhythmic, unified, and their faces were voids of darkness that swallowed the light. And yet Torres felt their gaze pierce through him, as if nothing he was remained hidden. And the procession passed no more than 50 meters away, with warriors, priests, women, and at the center, a shifting shape impossible to focus on, carried by 8 massive figures. And Torres felt a primal terror, older than war, older than humanity itself. And time dissolved until the last figure vanished into darkness. and the jungle slowly exhaled and sound returned, and Torres finally whispered to Kim, asking what they had just witnessed, and Kim answered with quiet dread that it had been exactly what he feared. Torres ended his final journal entry for day 1 at 17:30 hours, noting that the patrol base was secure, that all gear functioned, and that the weather remained stable, yet his pen lingered above the page as he admitted that something in the air felt wrong, and that the silence of the jungle pressed against him like a warning, and that the thermal readings made no sense, and that Sergeant Kim had not shown a hint of calmness all day, which for a man like Kim meant something truly serious lurked beyond the tree line. And as the darkness thickened over the mountain, Torres closed his notebook, unaware that within 6 hours the drums would pound again and nothing in his world would ever feel normal. And at 23:47 hours, while serving watch on the northern edge, he checked his time and counted the minutes until his shift ended while fighting the weight of exhaustion, and then he heard a slow, heavy thump that pulsed through the night like a distant heartbeat, and he thought at first it was the sound of fatigue tricking his mind, but the thump returned louder, deeper, undeniably real, and he whispered into the radio, reporting drums roughly 500 meters out, bearing 320, and Collins asked him to repeat himself, and Torres confirmed and added that the rhythm was growing louder and fiercer, and he pressed himself low in his position while gripping his rifle, and soon chanting layered beneath the drums, rising in ancient tones that carried through the mountains and stirred something primal inside him. And Hale ordered all personnel to fighting positions, keeping weapons tight, until they identified the threat, and Marines scrambled into their holes as Sergeant Kim slid in beside Torres with tension carved into every muscle of his face, and Torres whispered, asking if he heard it, and Kim answered that he did and told him to stay down and stay silent. And the glow of torchlight flickered through the trees, dozens of lights weaving and undulating in a long controlled line. And Torres reported multiple visual sources and counted at least 30 before freezing as the drums halted mid-beat, leaving the night in a suffocating silence. And then through night vision, he saw the figures emerging from the tree-line, tall spectral warriors wearing ancient Hawaiian garb adorned with feathered cloaks and towering headdresses, and gripping weapons made of wood, stone, and shark teeth, and every one of them moved with impossible precision. And what truly broke Torres was not their height or their armor, but their faces, which held nothing but voids of shifting darkness that swallowed the glow of the torches, yet still stared into him as if they recognized something buried in his soul. And Kim whispered, "Contact front," and urged absolute stillness as the procession passed less than 50 meters from their position. And Torres counted them in a trance: warriors, priests, women, robed in flowing garments, their hair drifting behind them like liquid shadow. And at their center, carried by 8 giants, lay a shape that refused to hold form, a presence that twisted every time he tried to focus upon it. And time lost meaning as the column marched on in silence, until finally the last torch dimmed and vanished into the forest. And then the world slowly exhaled. Insects resumed their song as if granted permission to exist again, and Torres released a breath he had unknowingly held as he whispered to Kim, asking what the hell they had seen, and Kim answered quietly that it was exactly what he had feared. And then the night spun into chaos when, in the early hours at 02:15, the command post erupted with confusion as every Marine reported the same sight, and Hale demanded that Lee replay the thermal footage from 2347 through 0017. Yet the recording displayed nothing and the audio held nothing, and Lee insisted the system had been functioning perfectly, and Collins argued that the entire squad could not have imagined Torch's armor and chanting, and Kim responded that the night marchers did not leave traces on machines built by men, and Hale shut down the argument, reminding them that Marines did not panic. Then Lee interrupted, revealing that the thermal signatures had returned, and they were closer, encircling the patrol base, and heat readings showed at least 30 shapes moving methodically in a tightening ring. And as if summoned by the realization, the drums roared again at 03:47 from every direction, and Torres barely had time to shout contact before one of the towering warriors burst from the darkness with inhuman speed, and Hale ordered open fire, and muzzle flashes tore the night apart as 12 Marines unleashed round after round into the advancing shapes. Yet the bullet passed through them like wind through smoke, and the warriors did not falter, and someone screamed over the radio that their rounds were ineffective before static devoured the transmission, and Hale demanded roll call. But 3 Marines did not answer: Davis, Morrison, and Santiago, and another voice shouted that one of the creatures had seized Davis and pulled him into the dark without a sound, and that Morrison had vanished beside him, and no one had seen what happened to Santiago, and Hale ordered a fallback to the rally point, and Torres ran harder than he had ever run, driven by terror rather than training, sprinting through vines, branches, and shadows, while the drums boomed behind him, and the chanting rose to a fevered pitch. And one by one the survivors crashed into the rally, clearing, gasping, shaking, and counting. Only 9 men left from the 12 who had entered the mountain, and Hale called roll again, discovering that Rodriguez had vanished as well, and no one knew when or how, and Hale sent a desperate call to range control, requesting emergency extraction, reporting multiple casualties, and giving their grid as 21.5612 by negative 157.9187, and the response, filled with static, told them help was on the way, though none of the dead would ever return. And as dawn crept into the sky, Torres realized that 4 Marines had been taken by something older than war itself. Kim answered Torres with a voice that carried the weight of ancient fear, and said that what they had witnessed was exactly what he had prayed they would never see, and at 02:15 hours the command post dissolved into barely controlled chaos as Captain Hale stood in the center demanding clarity, while every Marine confirmed the same impossible sight, and Lee replayed the thermal feed again and again, only for the screen to show nothing at all, and Collins insisted that an entire reconnaissance element could not hallucinate Torch's chants and faceless warriors, yet Lee shook his head with growing confusion because the system had recorded perfectly and should have shown dozens of heat signatures, but the data remained empty, as untouched as if the night itself had erased every trace. And Kim stepped forward and said the night marchers did not appear on recordings because they did not exist in any form our machines could capture, and Collins snapped that such a suggestion belonged in ghost stories told around a campfire. But Kim held his ground, and Hale finally silenced them all, declaring that Marines did not break under fear, and they would not abandon their mission yet. In same moment, Lee reported that the thermal signatures had returned and were now circling the patrol base with deliberate movement, and he counted at least 30 shapes drifting ever closer, as if tightening a noose around them. And then, without warning, the drums struck again at 03:47 hours, shaking the air with a deep, relentless pulse, and Torres had barely begun to shout contact when one of the towering warriors surged from the tree line with impossible speed, and Hale roared open fire, and the darkness ignited with muzzle flashes as 12 Marines unleashed fury into the shape that advanced upon them, and the jungle strobed with red and white light, and shell casings scattered across the ground, yet their rounds passed through the warriors as though they were striking fog, and someone screamed over the radio that the rounds were doing nothing before the signal crushed in static, and Hale demanded every Marine sound off, yet 3 names remained silent: Davis, Morrison, and Santiago, and a breathless voice shouted that Davis had been taken when a massive warrior grabbed him and pulled him into the dark without even giving him time to scream, and another Marine reported that Morrison had been beside him 1 second and gone the next, like he had been lifted from existence, and no one could say what happened to Santiago. And Hale ordered an immediate fall back to the rally point, and Torres ran with pure animal terror, crushing through vines, thorns, and roots as the drum pounded behind him and the chanting grew frenzied and violent. And when he burst into the rally clearing, he dropped to one knee with his rifle raised while his lungs burned and his vision swam, and one by one the survivors staggered into the space and counted themselves and found that only 9 men remained from the 12 who had entered the mountain. And Hale called roll again and realized that Rodriguez had vanished as well, and no one knew when or how because the jungle had swallowed him completely. And Hale grabbed his radio with trembling hands and called for range control, requesting emergency extraction, and giving their grid as 21.5612 by negative 157.9187, and static chewed the response, but the essential message reached them: help was on the way, though not for the ones already lost. And by 0847 hours, a UH-60 Blackhawk thundered into the clearing, kicking up dirt and debris as the exhausted Marines stumbled toward it, moving like survivors of a war they had never been trained to fight. And Torres felt his legs nearly fail as Sergeant Kim supported him toward the ramp, while the crew chief stared in horror at their faces and asked what had happened, but none of them answered because no words could begin to hold the truth. and the flight back to base passed in suffocating silence as Torres stared into the jungle below, expecting at any moment to see torchlight glowing through the canopy. Yet mountains appeared peaceful and serene, as if the horrors of the night had been nothing more than nightmare illusions. And when the helicopter landed, a crowd of officers and medical personnel rushed them, and Torres was separated from the others, placed into an ambulance, and questioned with rapid fire urgency about what happened, where the missing Marines were, and what threats they had encountered. Yet every time he opened his mouth, his voice died, because how could he describe warriors without faces and drums that shook the soul and blades that passed through flesh without striking? And on November 17, 2019 at 1400 hours, the survivors gathered in a sterile conference room inside the Naval Hospital, where bright lights hummed and senior officers watched them with cold scrutiny, and men in civilian clothing, who never gave their names, took notes without emotion. And Hale recounted the mission timeline in strict military terms, describing unidentified hostiles and an ambush executed with overwhelming coordination, and he omitted the details. No one would ever believe the procession, the chants, the figures immune to bullets, and Torres sat silent as their dead brothers were reduced to neat categories of loss. And when the civilians asked for photos or audio or thermal readings, Lee explained that nothing had recorded, and they exchanged looks that confirmed they already knew such outcomes were inevitable. And after 4 hours, the meeting ended with orders forbidding them to speak of the incident, and the official report would state that 4 Marines were lost in a training accident, and Torres felt something inside him break, because their brothers had not been lost, they had been taken. And on December 3, 2019 at 2200 hours, the weight of that truth still pressed upon him like a shadow that would never lift. Then he was gone, and the words hung in the cold morning air like a final verdict, because no one had seen Rodriguez vanish, and no one could explain how a trained Marine could simply cease to exist. And the drums still echoed inside their bones, even though the forest had grown silent as dawn crept across the ridgeline, and the 8 survivors stood trembling beneath the pale light, with eyes that looked older than they had the day before. And Hale steadied himself, forcing his voice to stay firm, as he ordered them to move south toward the extraction point. And Lee stared down at his thermal device, whispering that he counted well over 100 signatures encircling them only moments earlier, and though those shapes had faded with the rising sun, he warned that nothing in those mountains ever truly left. And Kim stepped forward, reminding Hale that their weapons did nothing, because they had seen bullets pass through the warriors without resistance. And Hale answered that if they could not fight, they would run, and if they could not outrun, they would evade, because reconnaissance Marines adapt and overcome. And so the shattered column began pushing through the jungle, stumbling over roots and ravines as they forced themselves south through thick brush that clawed at their gear, while fear gnawed at their lungs. And Torres felt every heartbeat like it might burst from his chest as he sprinted after the others, unsure whether minutes or hours passed, because the jungle blurred into a haze of green shadow and dread. And at last, as the first true rays of sunlight spilled across the mountains, the drums stopped, and the torches vanished, and the suffocating pressure that had stalked them all night lifted as though held at bay by daylight itself. And Torres collapsed against a tree, gasping and shaking, and Hale called for a sound off, and 8 voices answered, confirming that only 8 remained, and no one spoke of the 4 brothers who had been consumed by something that should not exist. And Hale raised his radio with unsteady hands and called range control, requesting immediate extraction, and reading off their grid point 21.5612 by -157.9187. And after bursts of static, the reply finally crawled through, confirming that help was on the way, but for the 4 missing Marines there would be no rescue, because the mountain had taken them in the dark and did not give back what it claimed. And at 0847 hours, the UH-60 Black Hawk thundered overhead, flattening the grass in a violent storm as it descended, and the surviving Marines stumbled toward it with hollow eyes and shaking limbs. And the crew chief looked at them with shock etched across his face as he shouted what happened out there, but none of them could answer, because words felt too small for what had stalked them in the night. And the flight back to K Bay passed in suffocating silence, while Torres stared at the passing jungle, fully expecting to see torchlight flickering between the trees, but the forest appeared serene, as if mocking them with its gentle morning calm. And when they landed, a swarm of officers, medical personnel, and unidentified officials waited to separate them and question them, and Torres found himself pulled into an ambulance where a corpsman asked what threats they faced where the missing Marines had gone and what they had seen, and Torres tried to speak, but each attempt dissolved into broken fragments, because how could he explain warriors without faces and torches that drifted like ghosts and drums that felt alive and ancient and hungry? And on November 16, 2019, the survivors were escorted to the Naval Hospital for evaluation, and on November 17 at 1400 hours, they were marched into a briefing room lit by harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed above their heads, where senior officers and civilians in plain suits waited without introducing themselves, and Hale recited the timeline with military precision, describing unidentified hostiles, evasive maneuvers, failed contact attempts, and the disappearance of 4 Marines, yet he did not mention the drums or the chanting or the way bullets passed through the warriors like through mist. And Torres understood why, because no one would believe them and no one wanted to. And Lee explained that all recordings contained nothing, and the civilians exchanged looks that suggested they had expected such an answer. And after 4 hours, the debrief ended with orders forbidding them to speak of the incident to anyone, and the official report would state that 4 Marines were lost in a training accident. And Torres felt anger and grief and disbelief churn inside him, because their brothers were not lost, they were taken by something older than the forest and stronger than the living. And when the survivors were dismissed, the command treated the matter as if closure had been achieved, though nothing had truly ended, because the drums still echoed in their memories and the silence of mountains still felt alive inside their dreams. And on December 3, 2019 at 2200 hours, Torres lay awake in his barracks, unable to sleep, because the absence of sound haunted him more than noise, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw torches drifting through darkness, and the face of Davis reaching toward him in a scream that never made a sound. And he understood then that the mountain had marked them all, and that no amount of distance or time would ever fully free them from what hunted them in the night. Torres could not sleep in the weeks after the incident, and every time he shut his eyes, he saw the faceless warriors drifting through the trees, or Davis reaching toward him in that final terrible moment before the darkness swallowed him whole. And on December 3, 2019, at 2200 hours, he sat alone in his barracks, staring at his green notebook with trembling hands, because writing had become the only way he could survive the memories, and each page held sketches of torches, ghosts, and jagged fragments of thoughts that made little sense. But he kept going, because stopping meant sinking into the same terror that hunted him in dreams. And a knock on the door startled him until Kim stepped inside, holding a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. And he looked as exhausted and haunted as Torres felt. And he said he thought Torres might need the company, and they sat in silence for a long while, letting the whiskey burn through their exhaustion, until Kim finally spoke and told him that he had gone to speak with elders in the Hawaiian community, men and women who carried the old stories and treated the mountains with a reverence outsiders rarely understood. And those elders had listened to his questions for a long time before answering, and they said the patrol had walked across a sacred path, a place where ancient chiefs once traveled between villages, and that the night marchers still claimed that path as their own, and anyone who crossed it without permission owed a price for the trespass. And when Torres repeated the word price with bitterness thick in his voice, Kim said the elders believed that the marchers took payment in the form of lives, and that 4 Marines had already been taken, and that the survivors were fortunate to still breathe at all, because usually no one lived after standing in the path of ghostly warriors. And Kim poured another glass and said they believed the only reason any of them remained alive was because some of them had shown respect by lying low and not looking directly at the marchers. And Torres remembered Kim pushing him down in the fighting hole, telling him to stay quiet, and he realized Kim had been relying on fragments of stories passed down through generations. And Torres asked if Kim had known what to do that night, and Kim said he had guessed because he had spent his life in strange, violent places where the world did not always follow rules written by men. And he said there are things older than governments, older than wars, older than the weapons men build, and those things do not care about tactics or rank, and they do not fear bullets, and they do not bend to our understanding. And when Torres asked what they were supposed to do now, Kim said they remembered Davis, Morrison, Santiago, and Rodriguez, because carrying their names was the only duty they had left. And so they raised their glasses to the fallen brothers who would never return, and the room fell still again, and Torres felt a weight settle inside him that he knew would stay for the rest of his life. And weeks passed, and nightmares followed. And on January 8th, 2020, Torres woke screaming again at 0300 hours, drenched in sweat and trembling as the dream of the drums and Davis reaching for him repeated itself in the same brutal loop. And his roommate had already requested a transfer because he could no longer handle the nightly screams. And Torres sat on the edge of his rack gasping for air and reached for his notebook because writing was the only thing holding him together, and he wrote that elders had said the Machers punished disrespect, yet Davis had not disrespected anything, so why him? And he remembered something he had not told anyone, not even Kim, something buried deep in the moment when Davis disappeared, a memory that had surfaced only when he forced himself to relive the nightmare. And he remembered seeing one of the faceless warriors turn toward Davis, and for a fraction of a heartbeat, he thought he saw something behind the void, not emptiness, but recognition, as if the thing knew Davis or had been searching for him specifically, and the thought terrified him so deeply. He snapped the notebook shut, unable to write another word, and the next morning he filed a transfer request, and he did not care where he went because anywhere was better than Hawaii, anywhere was better than the mountains where the dead walked at night. And he felt the command approve his request with unusual speed, almost as if they wanted the survivors gone, scattered, removed from the place where truth still whispered. And by February 2020, the survivors had begun to drift away from the Marine Corps and from each other like leaves shaken loose by a storm, and Reynolds transferred to Camp Pendleton, and Mitchell separated early, and others followed through medical channels that cited post-traumatic stress and trauma exposure. And none of them spoke of the incident again, and Torres kept writing because it was the only way he knew to keep his mind from fracturing under the weight of things that defied reason. And still, sometimes late at night, he unfolded a map of Hawaii and traced the outline of the Kahuku Mountains and the ridge where their patrol base had stood and the path where the Machers had walked, and he wondered if they still roamed those woods at night, still marching, still bound to their ancient routes. And he knew the answer even before asking himself, because some truths become part of you, and the truth was always yes, and it would always remain yes. And years passed, and the world moved on, but the mountains did not forget, and neither did the survivors, because the drums once heard never truly fall silent. The official record continued to list the 4 missing Marines as casualties of a training accident, and their bodies were never recovered despite long, frantic searches that stretched across the Kahuku Mountains in the weeks that followed. And the families received folded flags and soft-spoken condolences and explanations that did not explain anything at all. And yet truth has a way of clawing through the soil, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. And Private Michael Torres, who left the Marine Corps in the year 2021, carried that truth with him into a quiet life on the mainland, far from the ocean that once swallowed the last cries of his brothers. And he kept his green notebook locked in a drawer filled with entries that documented every detail he had seen and every fear that still crawled across his thoughts. And last year, he finally mailed that notebook to me with a single note that said, "Someone needs to know what really happened. Someone needs to remember them." And I spent months verifying everything I could, from mission logs to personnel files to restricted after-action summaries that were never meant to exist outside shadowed rooms. And although I cannot prove that the night marchers walked those mountains as real as any soldier of flesh, I can say with certainty that something happened in November of 2019, something that tore 4 Marines from the world, and something that the military sealed away with cold efficiency, as if truth itself were a threat that needed containment. And Corporal Marcus Lee, who once monitored signals for Echo Company, has since given sworn statements saying his equipment did not fail that night, but that whatever moved through those trees existed beyond the reach of technology built by human hands. And Lee left the military and became a researcher of the paranormal with focus on Hawaiian lore and stories of spectral warriors who march at night. And Sergeant Daniel Kim retired in 2022, ending 22 years of service, and he refused interviews but sent a single line through email that said, "Some things are better left in the dark." And Captain Jonathan Hale, promoted to Major in 2021, has never spoken publicly about that night. And Lieutenant Samuel Collins ended his own life in 2022, and in his suicide note, he wrote about faces without faces and drums that never stop even when the world around him fell silent. And though the Kahuku training area continues to be used for military exercises, sources inside command say that certain zones have quietly been restricted for night operations without official explanation. And meanwhile, the Hawaiian community still tells the same stories they have passed down for generations, stories about warriors who never stopped marching, stories about chants that echo across the ridges, stories about what happens when the living stand in the path of the dead, and the lessons remain unchanged. Respect the old paths, respect the old powers, respect the ancient ones who walked long before any uniformed soldier set foot upon the islands, because the dead do not care about rank or training or medals or missions. And if you do not show respect, they will take what they believe is owed. And at the end of Tora's notebook, one final entry sits written in hurried, uneven strokes, dated November 16, 2019, at 0400 hours, just after the sun began bleeding light over the mountains. And he wrote that 8 of them survived, though survival did not feel like victory, and he admitted he did not know what he had seen, and perhaps never would. And he wrote that some places are not meant for the living, that some paths belong to forces older than memory. And he wrote that they entered the mountains thinking they were training for war, believing they would face human enemies that could be met with rifles, skill, and courage. And he wrote that they learned instead that the real enemy was not human and not alive, at least not in any way he understood, because what rose in the dark was older than their weapons, older than their government, older than every war men had ever fought. And he listed the names of his brothers Davis, Morrison, Santiago Rodriguez, promising to carry their memories for the rest of his life. And he said he would always hear the drums when the night grew too quiet. And he closed his entry with the words, "We came out knowing fear that no training could prepare us for, and we can never speak of it because no one would ever believe us." And that note ends with Tora's out. And after reading his story, after verifying the pieces that could be verified, and feeling the weight of those that cannot, I can say there is something uniquely haunting about 4 young Marines who followed orders into the night and never returned, and something even more haunting about how swiftly their truth was sealed away, yet truth lingers like echoes bouncing across ridgelines. And I believe that anyone who walks those mountains at night should listen carefully, because if they hear drums whispering through the wind, they should run, because the dead still walk, and they do not forgive those who stand in their path. Brothers and sisters, that is the truth as close as any living man will ever hear it. And I will tell you this straight from the heart, those 4 Marines deserved answers and honor. And they never got either, so we carry their story because no one else will. And if you ever find yourself on those islands when the sun goes down, remember this warning. If you hear drums in the dark, do not look, do not breathe, run. If you felt this story hit your soul, then hit that like button and drop your thoughts below. Tell me where you are watching from and what you believe, and if you want more tales that pull you straight into the shadows, then subscribe right now, join the Rebel family, and stand with me on the front lines of the unknown. I will see you in the next one. Stay sharp, stay brave, and God be with you all.